about the truth about learning styles and why it matters for your child's success. As Shannon mentioned, my name is Ann Dolin, and I started out my career in education with Fairfax County Public Schools. And it was a time when phonics was out and whole language was in. And learning styles was all the rage. And it was at a time when my principal was really into the theory of learning styles. And so he sent all of us to a workshop. We learned to give our students a quiz and then teach to their modality. But I realized over time that it wasn't really working. And at first I thought maybe it was me as a teacher, but then I came to realize that actually students just don't learn one way. They actually have to learn through all three modalities to really, really make it stick. And then later on, when I left my teaching job and I started Educational Connections back in 1998, I also realized that when good instruction like that, in teaching kids in all three modalities, which we'll talk about in a second, was coupled with strategies like helping kids to be more organized and manage their time and study more effectively, it really took both approaches combined together where the magic really happened. And so learning styles aren't really cut and dry. We know now from lots of research in the past 10 years or so that actually in classrooms where teachers taught to a student's specific learning style, it actually didn't work at all. And we also know through newer research that those little quizzes that we used to give to our kids aren't actually that helpful. Now, that doesn't mean, even though we know that students don't learn through one modality, like they take this quiz and voila, they're auditory learners, it doesn't mean that they don't have a preference. And so many kids, and we've worked with kids, for 25 years, they are strong believers that, I like to learn visually, or I just do so much better when I write things down, which is kinesthetic, or I really like it when I'm in a group and I can talk about things. I learn great that way. So even though they may not have a style, they can definitely have a preference. So I'm curious, when you think about your own kids, where do you think they fall? Do you think their preference is visual, seeing things, auditory, listening, or do you think that they like to learn by doing? I'm curious, just throw that in the chat if you don't mind. Is your child's preference visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? Let's see what people are saying. Barb said visual. Visual, Anusha, visual. Kinesthetic, Gabby. Thanks for that. Joseph said by doing, by kinesthetic. We can also call that tactile. So another visual, another kinesthetic. So it looks like we've got a combination between visual and kinesthetic. And Stacy said, I have one of each kid. Somebody else said a combination. And that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And that's really what we see from kids too. It's uncommon when kids say, I like to learn auditorily. But interestingly, that's how American schools are set up. Teachers are in the front of the room and they're lecturing, and kids, especially now, since attention is so compromised, it's really hard for kids to learn that way. So I want to share with you some strategies for making a difference in your kids. And why does all this matter? Because we do want to honor our kids' feelings about this, about their preference. We can lean into their preference, but the key is to layer strategies on top of it. But it is really different for every kid. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Now, although it does matter in terms of the type of student and how they learn best, there are certain things we know about every type of student. And let me share with you this information. First, we know when it comes to learning that the timing at which kids do things matters. So if kids have 3 things to do after school, we know that kids should start with the hardest task first. they're more likely to get things done and procrastinate less. We also know that there are times of the day where people, not just kids, adults, everyone has different energy levels. And you can see here from this little chart that when we start out the day, we're kind of like, okay, in terms of our energy level and our focus and our motivation. But around 9 a.m. in the morning, that's when our alertness peaks. That's when we have the most energy, the most focus. We're able to do the hardest work. But as the day goes on, things change. And we end up getting into this trough at like 3 o'clock, which is when most people don't really feel that great. As adults, we grab a cup of coffee. For kids, they're coming home from school. And sometimes parents will say, hey, start your homework. And you get tremendous amount of pushback from your kids. And that's why they're in a trough. But we all seem to recover around 5 o'clock. And that's when we get some more energy back. It's never as good as in the morning, but it gets better. And for this reason, that's why standardized testing in school districts across the country are always in the morning, because kids learn best. And I share this with you because it's important as parents to know that there are specific times your kids are going to perform better than others. There are also times they're going to be more willing to talk to you and they're going to be in a better mood. And it isn't right after school. Now, here's what else I want to share. Kids with ADHD have a very specific time preference, meaning that, if you say to your child who comes through the door at 3 o'clock, I really want you to start your homework, even though they may not want to do it, they probably can get it done. But a child with ADHD is going to struggle in this area a lot because their time preference is more significant to them. So for those kids, I really recommend having a conversation with them about when starting homework is going to be best. So timing really matters when it comes to doing work and studying and focus. But I also want to share with you two of the very top. These are lots of research has gone into how kids learn. And regardless of their learning preference, what applies to all students is that there are two top ways they can retain and then use information the best. So here's what happens typically with kids. When they have to study for a test, they will take their notes or the study guide that teachers give them, or maybe like a unit overview page, and they'll take their information and they'll read it. And they'll read it again. And they'll read it again. And they'll announce, I've studied, I know this. Here's the problem, that 85% of kids in a survey reported studying like that, rereading, but it is the most ineffective way for kids to learn. Why is it ineffective? One, it's super passive. You're really not learning the information, you're just reading it. Two, it creates this illusion of knowing, meaning kids think they have command over the information, but they really don't. So what is the way to learn this information if it's not rereading? Well, the number one way is a concept called self-testing. It's kind of the opposite of rereading. So let's say your student is studying US history and they're on the Civil War and they have notes about the Civil War. And one of the questions is, what were the three causes of the Civil War? Now, if they're just rereading their notes, they're reading through it. But by self-testing, they cover the answer and they ask themselves, what were the causes? And they should be able to answer it themselves. And if they can't, they can then look back at the answer. But now it's active. You're making your brain work hard. You can use this same concept with the teacher study guide, which a lot of kids get. So you take that study guide, and what kids usually do is they'll fill it out in class. Fabulous. But instead of just rereading it, they make 2 more blank copies. And then the next day, they fill out the blank copy to the best of their ability. And then when they're super stuck, they can look back to get an answer if they have to. And then the next day they do it again. So this is called self-testing, and it's really valuable. We also teach kids how to create their own self-test, especially in math, which kids think is really hard to study for. Another way of using self-testing is through the software Quizlet, which a lot of kids use. So in order to use Quizlet correctly, they have to play the games and they have to be active learners instead of just looking at the flashcards. So we know self-testing trumps everything else. It's the #1 way of studying for all kids. The second way of studying, which is also up there, is this concept called distributed practice. Some people call it spaced practice. It's the same thing. So here's how it works. Instead of studying in an hour on Thursday night, you take that hour and you study for 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, 20 minutes Thursday. Why does that matter? Well, I ask kids this all the time. Why do you think that could make a difference? Not just doing better on the test on Friday, but why do you think when you take this approach and you have a unit exam or a midterm, why do you think you remember it so much better with that? And they say things like, oh, well, that's just because I practiced it more. Like, actually, you didn't really practice it more. It's the same amount of time. And they're kind of stumped. Here's the answer. It's sleep. Sleep is an unbelievably powerful study tool. So when kids learn something and then they sleep on it, well, your brain is rehashing everything that went on during the day. And it's kind of reconfiguring all that information, putting it into long-term memory. So the more we do things over time, the better it is. And lots of research shows that this is the second best way for kids to learn, distributed practice. All right, so let's get back to learning styles. Now, I mentioned that we want to start with our kids' preference. So if our child says, I like learning by visual, I like looking at videos, I like when the books have diagrams or pictures, I like it when my teacher has a PowerPoint in front of the class and I can see it instead of just hearing it. So we might start with the child's preference and then add some layers. So let's take that student who likes it the other way. This is a strategy with auditory preferences. So this is a student who likes listening to lectures or listening to conversations within groups. And often these kids say, oh, I am so good at this. I don't need to write stuff down, but they do. So the extra layer on top of their preference would be taking notes. Many parents report to us, and we do so much of this kind of tutoring, helping kids to manage their time, to study more effectively, to stay organized. We call it executive function coaching because these are all cognitive processes that are important for school success. Parents will say to us, my child either won't take notes or really doesn't know how to take notes. And it's a very common problem. We're seeing this more now than ever before. It's almost like if kids missed out on this skill earlier, it's been really hard to teach them in the classroom. So we've spent time in our sessions when we work with kids one-to-one, really on note-taking skills. So I'll share with you one skill that's probably the most popular one across the country, and it's called Cornell Notes. And it kind of goes back to that self-testing concept. Here's how Cornell Notes work. The student can open Google Docs on their laptop, or if they have a piece of paper, they draw a line down the middle, down the third of their page. So they have 1/3 of their page for key ideas. And on the other 2/3 of the page is the notes. So let's say the topic is Guatemala. And the idea is they're studying the 4 neighboring countries. So the notes might be, it's a country in Central America, and it borders Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. So the student might write that there. So you can kind of see how this works. Why is this powerful? It's not always that you take notes, it's not always a value of taking notes. It's what you also do with those notes. So if you take your notes and you cover the note side, 2/3 of it, and you look at the key idea and you ask yourself, where is Central America, or where is Guatemala, and what are the 4 neighboring countries? You're self-testing, and you can uncover and see if you're right. And then the other part of Cornell Notes is when you get done taking notes, at the bottom in your own words, you want to summarize what you've learned. And this is just like in one sentence, or a couple of phrases. That kind of helps you to capture the summary, to kind of consolidate it. So those are ways to that's one way to take notes for kids that are auditory learners. So let's go back again, auditory learners or auditory preferences. And these are kids that kind of the same. They really, really like group study sessions. We see this a lot with college students. So what is that added layer? Well, it's making flashcards. We used flashcards when we were kids, and it's easy to think flashcards are old-fashioned, but they're not. There's a ton of research that shows the value of flashcards. So again, you take your preference of listening in a group study session, and now you're going to make flashcards. So you've gone from just auditory to visual, because flashcards are visual, and kinesthetic or tactile, because you're actually having to do it. Now you've got all 3 modalities. All right, what about a student who's a visual learner? They don't mind reading. They kind of like it. The problem with just reading is that you're not asking yourself the importance of what you're reading. And so oftentimes kids will read something and they get to the end and you say, what was important? Or can you summarize this for me? Or what was this about? And they might know bits and pieces, but not big picture. Or sometimes they'll say, I don't know, I think I should reread it. So if you do like to read, the comprehension piece is super important. And you don't want to highlight as you read, which is what a lot of kids do, because they think I'm a visual learner, let me just be highlighter happy. And that is a bad idea, because as you're reading, you don't know what's important in the moment. You really don't know. So if you're highlighting everything, it's not helpful. So here's what you do. You read it and you say, ask yourself, what's important here? What do I need to know? Then you go back and in the note column, or you annotate in some way, in the margins, you're just jotting down a couple of phrases about what's important. You can at that point go back and use a highlighter and highlight what's important, but never use a highlighter as you're reading. All right, so let's go back to those visual kids again. These are kids that don't mind reviewing the teacher's slide deck. Usually the teacher will post the slide deck in the student's portal and the kids can use it for a review. So if your base layer is visual for this, looking at the slide deck, you can make it tactile or kinesthetic by also taking digital notes. And so you can type in your notes, and you can also ask yourself, what's important here? Now, what about the student who's a kinesthetic learner? These are kids that like to learn by doing. They might like arts and crafts. They might like science experiments. They often have to learn by jotting things down. So they might take notes in class. However, they can take those notes, make a copy of them, and then cut them up. And I love doing this with kids because it helps them to, especially if they have Cornell notes, to be able to almost make little flashcards out of their notes or move the notes around and practice them in the self-testing method. And kids actually like doing this. It's fun because it's also tactile to their preference, but now it's visual as well. What about other kids that are kinesthetic? A lot of students love Quizlet. Quizlet is great, but oftentimes kids will take somebody else's flashcards. So like, let's say they're in AP Bio and they have a quiz on the second unit, vocabulary words. Chances are many people have already created that slide deck in Quizlet. And so kids will often go back and get somebody else's slide deck and just practice that. Ideally, they're making their own slide deck. But even if they're resistant to that and they only have the visual part of Quizlet, they can also add auditory notes in Quizlet. You can talk out the flashcard. You can put it in your own words, and you can put that auditory clip on your flashcard. You can also play games, as I mentioned, in Quizlet, and that makes it kinesthetic. That makes it visual as well. And then the auditory obviously makes it auditory. So now you've got all three modalities. So what are some concerns that we see for kids? Certainly motivation is one of them. And sometimes parents will say, my child might have a preference, but getting him to engage in one of those preferences can kind of be hard. So when it comes to motivation, I want to just share with you just some kind of nuts and bolts of the self-determination theory and what it takes for kids to be motivated. Number one, kids have to feel like they have competence to do well. So when we talk to them about studying, they have to feel like, okay, I can do this and I can do well. We often see the issue of competence in cumulative subjects where one skill builds upon another, definitely in math. So kids have to feel like they can do the work. They have to have the autonomy to do it. So if kids feel micromanaged all the time, then they may not be as motivated as if they had autonomy to do it like they want to do it. And then the other part is relatedness. The student has to feel like the task at hand is meaningful to them. And this catches a lot of kids up. Sometimes kids will say, this is dumb, this Pythagorean theorem. I'm never really going to have to know this in real life. Why do I have to study this? I'm never going to use it. And that is true. They may not ever use the Pythagorean theorem, but many kids can say to themselves, yeah, this is dumb. I'm probably never going to use this. However, I still want to get a decent grade in math because it's part of my grade point average. And although I never want to study math again, I really want to get into the Savannah College of Art and Design and, follow my passion of art, but I need this math grade. So even though they may not relate to the math, they have a purpose of further out. And so for kids that really struggle with relatedness, when we work with them, we often talk about the purpose beyond math and getting kids to think about the future and think more about of what this can lead to later on, that this is just a stepping stone in a bigger picture, often helps with motivation. So sometimes kids are resistant, they're resistant to studying more effectively and using some of the skills that we know around learning styles. And we see that a lot with kids where they often have grand ambitions, like, I want to get good grades, but they really struggle to take the steps necessary to get good grades. And, oftentimes when we have kids that are resistant, we want to figure out where they're willing to let us help them. And this is key for parents too. Often what we believe to be so as parents and what we want for our kids is not at all what they want. So we might think, I really want my child to learn how to study better. I mean, he really just doesn't know how to study. Or I really want my child to be organized. If he was just more organized, school would be so much easier for him. But then, so we hear this from parents on the phone when they call our office looking for help. But then when we meet with the child, they're like, I'm not going to work on organization. I'm fine. That's not my issue. My issue is that, I just really want to do a better job in this science class. Or my issue is that I really don't understand this. So when we start out with kids, we give them a self-assessment to understand with these executive function skills, with studying and organizing and planning time, where is it that they see their problem? Not where the parent says the kid has a problem, but where does the child see that this is an issue for them? And that's always where we start, especially with studying, because if the student says, I'm not going to work on organization, but I am willing to work on this other thing, you always want to start with the other thing. Eventually, as educators, we can get to the organization later on, but initially, we want to build trust with kids and make sure that they see us as an ally. Same with parents. You know, our goal is to make sure that kids feel like we're a collaborative force, we're on their side, and that we're in this together. And here's why. You know, sometimes kids have all levels of willingness to accept help. And sometimes kids come to us and they're at the bottom rung, and they don't think that they have a problem and they don't want to change. But more typically, kids know, you know, they have a sense that things aren't going quite as well as they want them to. And they do see that maybe I'll change my habits just a little bit. So you can see here the stages of behavior change. Anytime somebody wants to change a habit, whether it's studying more effectively, exercising more, or having a better diet, we all come to the table at a varying degree of change, where we're, you know, are we willing to make change? And if we are we willing to accept help? So our goal for kids is to understand where is the student, and where are they with other skills, like maybe not organization, but maybe better study habits, because typically they're higher in one skill than another skill. So when we work with kids, we want to help. We also want them to be accountable. And that's key too, is that, you know, anytime, you know, we're helping kids or you're working with your kids, we want to just check in with them on occasion and say, how are you doing? How are things going? How are you feeling about this subject? Tell me about math. Oh, really? Tell me a little bit more. So in other words, having an open dialogue with our kids is incredibly important. You know, sometimes we think our kids should be able to study. They should know what their learning preference is and be able to do all of these things. But the truth is, for many kids, it is difficult. So as much as we can open the dialogue and have regular conversations about school, not passing judgment, but hearing what they say, that really helps students. And it can help them to really keep an eye on what's going on and not feel so alone. So if at any point, you know, we can help your child, we're happy to do so, and we're here for you. We specialize in kids that need help studying more effectively, being organized and planning their time. And you can see our website. We have a lot of information on learning styles, learning preferences, and executive functions. And our website is ectutoring.com. I also compiled a lot of resources for parents, and that's also on our website. And that's called, the specific URL is at the bottom of this, and it's ectutoring.com/webinar-resources. And one thing I think that's super helpful for parents is the talking points around talking about studying and school and grades and all those kinds of things, because sometimes the conversations can turn negative and we don't want that. So I've scripted out how to talk to kids about these things, and you can find that, the communication part, on webinar resources too.